off of mute. Hi, welcome everyone to the HR Roundtable. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's definitely, I can hear the wind for those of you that are in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. It's definitely a chilly day for us here today. Thank you for joining us. So very excited to have everybody here and to have our special guest with us, Victoria Mattingly. She's been providing diversity, equity, and inclusion and learning and development consulting services to businesses and nonprofit organizations for over 10 years. She's built and implemented DEI solutions with companies such as Intel, American Eagle, Sargent & Lundy, Project Management Institute, Forte Foundation. She's also the founder and the CEO of Mattingly Solutions, a woman-owned DEI consulting firm that specializes in research and implementation of workplace interventions that result in happier employees, better leaders, healthier company cultures, and a more inclusive and equitable workforce. She is a subject matter expert on measuring and developing inclusive behaviors and allyship, having wrote her dissertation on the build and evaluation of an executive allyship training program and continuing her allyship work in the form of corporate training, keynotes, webinars, and her virtual course, Ally Up, which has been taken by over 3,600 students. So we're very happy that she's able to join us today at the HR Roundtable. I'm PJ Trudeau, running the Roundtable and have been for, I guess, quite some time at this point. Wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about today what we'll be doing. I am recording the session so that I can follow up with summary notes afterwards and any resources that we want to make sure that are shared and that you have the ability to access after the session. Also, as you have questions or comments, please go ahead and post those in the Zoom for us. We'll still follow our pretty standard format as Victoria will has a question for us, and I'm going to go ahead and put it now and kind of turn it over to her before we go into the breakout groups, and she will tell us a little bit about what it is she'd like for everyone to discuss into the breakout groups, and then we'll come back into the main room and have a discussion of that and some further conversation. So Victoria, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, PJ. And do you mind if I share my screen before we head off to the breakout rooms?
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, PJ. I really appreciate it. I'm so thrilled to be here with everyone today. I am a clinical extrovert, so this time has been especially challenging for me. So this is as good as it gets right now in the times we're in. So super grateful that y'all are spending this hour with us and getting some social interaction during this challenging time we're facing. I'm going to be talking a little bit about defining the I in DE&I. So DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, is a really pressing and high priority issue right now in the HR space. As PJ shared, I've been doing this work really solely for 5 years and doing learning development and people analytics type work for the last 10 years. And what I was finding a lot in my conversations with HR and also executive leaders trying to really do DEI right is there's a pretty clear understanding of how we define diversity, right? It's that HRIS data, it's the demographic data. We can all, even just looking at the videos on the screen, we can kind of get a sense of how diverse this group is just by looking at who's on the call. But when it comes to really defining and understanding and operationalizing inclusion, we don't have as clear consensus or an idea of what that means. And so that's really going to be the focus of the talk today and the breakout rooms that we'll be heading in shortly. PJ already gave a great intro for me, so I'll just skip through this really quickly. I did want to mention my company, Mattingly Solutions. We are based up here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just 4 short hours away from those of you who are down in DC. We specialize in DEI measurement and strategy, developing inclusive behaviors and allyship training programs. And that's our website if you wanted to check us out and see what we're all about. All right, so this is going to be interactive as I share my background. Before I was in DEI, a really strong background in learning and development. So this will not be a passive meeting here by any means, but take a moment and think about what's one characteristic about yourself that when people see this or know this about you, you suspect that you might be treated differently. So take a moment, think about what is one characteristic. I'm going to share mine if I can find the chat. Yeah, there it is. Whenever I share with people that I'm a mom, I have a 6-year-old who's downstairs doing virtual kindergarten at this moment. People have perceptions of what that might mean about me. Does that mean I'm not going to be as committed to my job? Does it mean I'm going to have to request off for more time? Does it mean that my husband should make more money than me because he's the perceived breadwinner? And there's a lot of bias and all those assumptions. But feel free to share some more. I see someone's name. So what our names are, absolutely. Age is a really big one. At both ends of the spectrum, right? Being an older employee, being a younger employee, and how do we, create connections across those generational divides, nationality, race, having an accent, what your hair looks like, what your dress looks like, where you're born and raised, being Christian, your race, what's your ethnicity, where you live. So all of these are characteristics of our identity, of who we are. And not only is it how we, identify with ourselves, but also how we're perceived in the world. So I have a point that I'm getting at here, which is diversity is how we see each other, but inclusion is how we treat each other. So really getting at the fact that who we are then impacts how we are perceived and also how we're treated. And then the flip side of that, how we see others, then whether we're aware of it or not, impacts how we treat others. And so DE&I and inclusion specifically is all about how we treat others and making sure that regardless of what someone looks like, what their background is, where they come from, that we're giving people that same degree of respect and value and appreciation regardless of what they look like. So thank you for humoring me and sharing those characteristics in the chat there. So we're going to talk a little bit about inclusive behaviors, and then I'm excited about jumping into the breakout rooms to really hear what y'all have to say and how you see these come out in your work as an HR professional. So this is our proprietary model of inclusive behaviors, and we can break them down into 3 categories, starting with everyday inclusion. So what do we mean by everyday inclusion? So this has to do with psychological safety, which psychological safety means that we're actively building a culture where people feel like they can feel safe speaking up and sharing what's on their mind, sharing their contributions, micro affirmations, which I'll share a little bit about here shortly. And also emotional intelligence has a lot to do with inclusion, everyday inclusion, how we treat each other in our everyday interactions. So quick model of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence has to do how we understand and our emotions and how we use our behaviors and our emotions both within ourselves and others. So how you know yourself, self-awareness. For those of you who've taken unconscious bias training and doing that bias work, there's a lot of self-awareness that goes on in that introspection. And also how we take care of ourselves at work. And especially now we're all in this virtual environment and really having those boundaries and the self-advocacy that has to do with inclusion as well, because we know, as I mentioned, I have my son downstairs doing virtual kindergarten. And so having even the boundaries for myself and okay, like I have the stop sign on the door, he's not going to barge in if all goes as well. Also the others parts, this is where inclusion really starts taking hold. So how do we observe and listen to and learn about others, really understand that other experience and empathy and compassion. Also, how can we connect and collaborate in really authentic ways, knowing that we are all bringing unique characteristics to the table. That's really the power and strength of diversity. I'm sure a lot of you already are well aware of. Also, when it comes to everyday inclusion or everyday interactions, there's a lot of talk out there about microaggressions. And for those of you who might not know microaggressions or don't have a full understanding, I like to think about them in terms of death by 1,000 paper cuts. So one paper cut's not going to kill you, but over time, having that same slice over and over and over again, what that ends up looking like in the workplace is people being burnt out, people leaving the company, people never fully reaching their potential, feeling that they can contribute because over time you just you don't have anything left to give. A really great video about microaggressions that I recommend using in any education that you're doing at your company around microaggressions is this video on mosquito bites and equating microaggressions to mosquito bites. It's phenomenal. It's like 4 minutes in length. There's a link there that my intern, Sophie, is actually on the call. She's going to be sharing some links with you all today. So feel free to take that link. That is a post that we shared on our LinkedIn page, and that video is just phenomenal. Such a great resource. So what's the flip side of microaggressions? That's microaffirmation. So the same way that we have these seemingly innocuous little negative behaviors that then impact and turn into a pretty big deal over time, we could have that opposite effect as well. These otherwise innocuous, very small, little positive behaviors that over time let people know that they are valued and seen and respected and heard in their everyday interactions. So these include things like using inclusive language, the example someone shared earlier about, their name, making sure that you get, unique names right, get that pronunciation right. Don't be ashamed or embarrassed to ask, how do you pronounce that? And also having the humility to say, oh, I got that wrong. Help me get it right again, right? Making eye contact, having tone, having body language, using your video when you can. I understand Zoom fatigue is real, right? We have to have those boundaries, but what can we be doing in these small micro behaviors to show others that we appreciate them, value them, and make them feel included? Okay. Second level up of inclusive behaviors is inclusive leadership. So I fully believe that we all have the capacity to be leaders, that you don't need a formal supervisory or management title to be a leader. But leaders do have a level of power and status they could leverage to create the inclusive cultures that a lot of companies are striving to build at this moment in time. So inclusive leadership includes things like understanding and meeting diverse needs of your team. And I'm going to share a case study of how I'm doing just that with a client right now, helping them to really meet the needs of their individual team members. Also holding others accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Something that's so basic that really can have a lot of impact when it comes to building a diverse, equitable, inclusive organization is just sheerly talking about it, saying that how this is important work, how this company values this work, having definitions and core language around DE&I, and having it be part of the regular conversation that's coming out of leaders' mouths, just to make it known that this is work that we value here and it matters. And also intentionally building diverse teams. So looking, are we giving equal opportunity for diverse assignments, for task forces, for people who are being nominated into succession planning? There's a lot of really phenomenal things leaders can be doing. And I'm going to share a case study of some work I'm doing now. So at one of our client companies, they're working on really incorporating inclusive leadership into their competencies. So they're revamping their leader competencies, and we're intentionally putting items in around how they're making their team feel valued, respected, seen, and heard. So they're going to be evaluated on their inclusive leadership behaviors. Also, just to kind of get this work underway before those new competencies come out, they were given a challenge. So the 500 plus leaders at this company were told that they're going to be expected to go and have conversations with their teammates. Maybe give them some language and some conversation starters to use to ask each individual teammate that they're responsible for, what can I do as your leader to make you feel more valued, respected, seen, and heard? And just having these conversations, and them to provide them that support after having these conversations, because we know that's being vulnerable, putting themselves out there. This is a energy and manufacturing company, so this is very touchy-feely stuff for them, even though we're making the case for how leading inclusively is going to lead to better teams and better productivity as a result. We want to provide them support, so we did a lunch and learn just last week. We had over 200 of these leaders attended this lunch and learn, where they talked about how these conversations are going, successes they've had, barriers they're facing, and having these conversations, and also some early wins of seeing how their teams are being impacted by having these conversations and being more intentional in their inclusive leadership. During that lunch and learn, we had them all fill out a Google Docs. They were all the 200 leaders on this Google Doc at the same time. They were in small breakout rooms, and they were sharing strategies that they've been finding that are helpful, either having these conversations or implementing the feedback that they received from their team. And we pulled it all together, aggregated it, made a really nice toolkit for these leaders to use. Now they have the toolkit in hand. We just delivered it to them yesterday, and soon they're going to have accountability groups where they'll be meeting in small groups to continue this work, talk about the strategies they're using, and continue to come up with more ways they can be inclusive leaders on their team. So final area of allyship, and then we'll get off to the breakout rooms, but I would love to talk a little bit about allyship with you all today. Allyship is, so there's a really incredible stat from Boston Consulting Group that shows that DEI initiatives that intentionally include allies are 3 times more likely to show progress on their DEI outcomes compared to initiatives that do not involve allies. And if you think about it, ally, and I'll define that shortly, but typically for someone to be an ally, they're a majority group member. These are people that don't typically see themselves as part of DEI programming, when in actuality, inclusive cultures affect everyone. We need a critical mass. Everyone needs to be doing these behaviors, doing this work to see that actually come out in the culture. And so by implementing and using allies, bringing people into the conversation, giving people the tools to do this work, like bystander intervention, how to stand up and speak up when you see something happening that's not fair, that's detrimental to certain groups or individuals, how to be a better sponsor. So leveraging your privilege and your status to help pull someone up through the ranks and share your network, share your resources, and also just activism. So thinking about non-parents advocating for parental leave, or thinking about, someone advocating for maybe a religious holiday that should be celebrated that they don't necessarily celebrate. So there's lots of work that allies can be doing to really accelerate DEI progress at organizations. Also, this is a pyramid, not just because it looked pretty, but this is intentional. So difficulty of use. So we could all be using everyday inclusive behaviors in our everyday interactions and any one-on-one, any group meeting you have. Allyship takes more risk, it takes more courage, it takes more work, it takes more time. So the difficulty of use increases as we go up this pyramid. All right, so what is allyship? Allyship is an ongoing relationship between an ally and their partner working together toward the shared goal of fairness, equity, and social justice. So allies use their power and status to support and advocate for someone who doesn't share a key part of their identity. And that third part is where I really draw my line in the sand when it comes to allyship, because all these inclusive behaviors, they're all great too. I don't want to ever downplay, whether it's everyday inclusion, inclusive leadership, allyship, these are just people treating other people well at the end of the day, right? But to be an ally, that person that you are going out of your way for, that person you are supporting and advocating for, it needs to be different than you in some substantial way. So whether it's male allies for women, straight allies for the LGBTQ plus community, white allies for people of color, there needs to be some sort of going across difference for it to be allyship. Otherwise, it's just people being good people, which is all great, but don't call yourself an ally unless you really have that, meaningful going out of your way to connect and support across difference. Allyship behaviors can be broken up in these 4 quadrants. So providing ongoing support to an individual. So sponsorship or mentorship would be a great example of that. Also providing ongoing support to a community. So fighting for policy change, looking out for some of those examples I gave before about parental leave or advocating for a religious holiday or whatnot. Also, there's in the moment allyship. So things like you're in a meeting and someone's idea just got completely steamrolled over, or even worse, someone just stole their idea and took it as their own. They said it 20 minutes ago in the meeting, someone just took their idea and acted like it was their own. So amplifying would be say, oh, that was a great point you made, PJ. PJ made that point 20 minutes ago. Thank you so much for that. And just giving that credit where it's due, or whenever their voice isn't being heard, giving them that space and platform. Also in the moment advocacy. So bystander intervention would be a great example of this, calling out instances of inequity when we see it happening on the spot. All right, so here is our breakout room question, and PJ is going to send us off into those here shortly. Before we do that though, PJ, can we run the poll? I totally forgot about that. There's a quick poll we wanted to run before we head off to breakout rooms. All right, so how does your organization define inclusion? So take a moment. Is it more of an abstract philosophical idea, something we know we need to do, but there aren't solid words behind it? Is it tangible items like gender neutral bathroom, vegetarian options? Is it culture? Is it leadership, communication? If it's something else, please share that in the chat. I'm so curious to know. Give you everyone a few minutes to submit those polling responses. Just a few more seconds to submit your response if you haven't had a chance to yet. All right. Perfect. Let's share those results. All right, so about almost 2/3 exactly said culture, and that's very common. I see in a lot of the client work we do, and just the DEI space, building an inclusive culture is such a huge focus. But there's a lot of areas in this response. So the moral imperative, about a quarter of the group, another quarter of the group, these tangible evidence of inclusion that we see. Leadership and communication, which is what I'm talking about in the inclusive leadership model, and other. I'm curious what people have said in the chat. Yeah, mindset, inclusive mindset, absolutely. So all this is to say, there's a lot of work to be done to really get a more standardized operational definition of what inclusion is, because until we really nail down what inclusion is, how can we ever possibly develop it, measure it, figure out if we're making progress toward it? Because it is this kind of abstract ideal at times. I kind of feel like we're just sort of throwing darts at the wall, not sure where we're hitting. So I encourage you all to, in the work you're doing, and if you are a DEI advocate, a practitioner, really, get really down to the nitty gritty of what inclusion means at your organization. How can you define it? How can you operationalize it? How can you measure it to then see more inclusive behaviors and achieve this inclusive culture that we're all trying to get to? So with that being said, I think it'd be a great time to head off to the breakout rooms. This will be the question you'll be discussing, which is, what changes would you expect to see if your organization began operationalizing inclusion as employee and leader behavior? So imagine if we isolated inclusion as a behavioral construct, what changes would you expect to see as a result?
Victoria, we'll be in the breakout rooms for about 20 minutes or so.
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Okay, everybody should have received an invite on their screen. See you in a few minutes.
So I was able to pop into 2 breakout rooms and heard some really great examples of inclusion in action, especially in a lot of your roles as HR professionals. But I'd love to just take a little time to hear about some key takeaways or kind of ahas, especially when it comes to redefining inclusion as behaviors. What were some highlights of the rooms that you could share with the main group?
So in our group, I felt like, and Patricia actually brought this, so definitely not my idea, but I thought she talked a lot about transparency. So that would be, and how transparent her organization is in terms of having employees involved from a strategic level, financials, having organization-wide meetings. And I thought the way that she put it was, I hadn't thought about, having employees involved in the strategic planning process being a behavior or act of inclusion. And so I thought just the way that she put it was like, oh, yeah, I get, that is part of that and having that. So that was one of my big takeaways from our group.
I love that. I love that. I've said it a few times. I regret not putting it on a slide, but the way we define inclusion, at least in Mattingly Solutions, and what I'm seeing in the literature as well, is the behaviors we can use to make others feel valued, respected, seen, and heard. And I can't think of a better way to elevate that employee voice than to include them in strategic planning. I love that example. Thank you for sharing that, Tammy. Who else has something to share from what was going on in the breakout rooms?
I think a lot of us talked about, maybe perhaps have already undergone some training or kind of starting at the beginning of, outlining just, maybe perhaps creating a committee and just some kind of initial starting points on this DEI journey. But I think a lot of us are still kind of stuck in, okay, we did the training. Now, where do we go from here? What are the actions, right? And so I think it was interesting to hear that a lot of us are kind of in that area and trying to think, what can we do next, right? Staff want to see the actions and try to figure out how do we go about doing that. So it was helpful in my group to kind of have that conversation and hear what others are starting to do, whether it's working with a committee or really identifying change agents within your organization to volunteer their time to kind of figure out what are the priorities and what are the initiatives that need to be moved forward to implement some of this change in the action. So.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And something I was hearing in some of the other breakout rooms, when I think about inclusion, I think about it, as the things that we could all be doing. Like inclusion is everyone's responsibility if we're going to do it right. But there's two types of actions. There's the actions that we could be doing as HR professionals, as leaders, as you mentioned, creating the task forces. Someone in one of the breakout rooms mentioned about blind hiring processes. So taking off certain identifiable information to try to make a fair hiring process, getting people in these roles and also communicating that those actions are happening to meet those desires of the workforce, like, hey, now what's next? But also there's the HR action, but then there's the actions that everyone could be using themselves, doing their work and giving those tools to employees, to leaders, and helping them understand what's their role in inclusion. At the end of the day, I think a lot of people choose to not be more inclusive, not because they are against it or they want to exclude or they're jerks or whatnot. It's actually because they just don't know what to do and they're afraid of doing the wrong thing. So even just inviting those to the table and saying, hey, this is what we're expected to do now. Inclusion is good leadership. Inclusion is good teamwork. Inclusion is good communication, and just kind of giving that language and those tools around it. I wouldn't be surprised to see some behavior change as a result. One more breakout room. Can someone else share us just a key insight or a strategy discussed in one of the breakout rooms before we kind of wrap everything up?
Yeah, we discussed in our breakout room about the remote people, that sometimes when you have groups that are remote and other people that are not, it was, difficult to include everyone. But with the pandemic, that gave us all the chance to get the people that are remote the same voice as the other ones. So this was one thing we discussed. We also talked about being mindful about the different holidays that the people are celebrating and not putting meetings in the calendar, and really respecting and being inclusive of that. And then the third topic that we talked about was about food. When people are, let's say, intolerant to dairy or have any other intolerances and they don't feel included because they were invited to lunches and things like that, and now by being remote, we don't have that as much.
Yeah, as much of the negative impacts of COVID and this world we're living in right now, I feel like there are some silver linings in this kind of leveling the playing field, having reasons to have these conversations, to check in more often and to make sure we're providing our employees with the resources they need. I feel like it's actually kind of accelerating more inclusive behaviors in a way out of necessity. And my optimism is that we're going to take these best practices back into the workplace whenever we do return to work, whatever that ends up looking like. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for having good conversations around this. I love learning about what inclusion and DEI more broadly looks like at organizations. So it was really great to get a little glimpse into the work that y'all are doing as HR professionals. I did want to share my screen just to kind of wrap things up. And then of course, I'll kick it back to PJ to close out the session. So can you all see my screen? Great. Okay, so two calls to action for you all today. So first off, let's connect. So Sophie's going to share my LinkedIn profile into the chat. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on there. I'm always sharing out new ideas, new strategies. I actually have the most viral post I've ever had on LinkedIn, which is a feature in Microsoft Word. So the way that Microsoft Word can check for your spelling and your grammar, they can also check for how inclusive your language is based on cultural bias, gender, ethnicity. And so I'll make sure to reshare that today so it comes at the top. But it's the most popular post I've ever put up there, and I'm going to do a little video on it here in the next week or so. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. Second call to action, if you are responsible for DEI outcomes at your organization or know the person at your organization who is, I get the sense that a lot of people on the call are just the beginning of their DEI journeys, and that's kind of where we are as a country right now. What used to be a check the box once the year diversity compliance training, I feel like companies are really understanding this needs to be a long-term embedded strategy into our organizations. So if you are that decision maker, or you know the decision maker, please connect with me. I just to have a conversation. As I said, I love learning about what's going on at companies, and if I could be of service or just share some ideas for 30 minutes, I'd love to have a conversation. And then finally, a little bonus is a thank you for all of you being on the call today and sharing your time with this desperate extrovert looking to make connections. I wanted to say thank you by sharing a little voucher with you all. So PJ mentioned at the very beginning that I have a really popular course on Udemy. It's on their Udemy for Business platform, which is their version of kind of LinkedIn Learning. And it's been taken by almost 4,000 students. And I wanted to share a 25% off voucher with you all. That is the link for that. Sophie's also going to share that in the chat. The course is all about allyship. So using allyship to accelerate your DEI programming. It's been used not only at the individual level, but also the corporate level. So Udemy also uses it in their corporate DEI training and their learning journey there. A company, SV Academy, has used it in their training protocols as really great reviews. Here's a couple of testimonials. But this voucher is for 25% off. It expires in about 2 weeks. So if you plan on using it, I recommend using it soon. And if you have professional development funds, might be a good use of that. So I know we're not able to go to conferences or really utilize those resources as well. So for a little self-education, also we have a bigger program that uses this exact course as an asynchronous hybrid learning program where your employees will learn about allyship, and then Mattingly Solutions comes in and does a whole company-wide training, or more of these kind of that inclusive behavior challenge that I mentioned earlier. So just wanted to share this information. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with you all. Here's all the ways to get in touch with me, and that's all I have for you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and kick it back over to PJ.
Victoria, thank you so much. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I hope it was helpful, provided you some insight, a different way to think about things, and other things that we could potentially be doing as we look to move forward. Anyone have any other questions, comments before we end today? All right, wonderful. I hope that you all have a great rest of the day. Please remember, you guys are doing a fantastic job. You know that everything that you are thinking about doing or discussing with your organizations, things that we talked about today, these are all ways where you're doing everything you can to make sure that that employee experience is the best it can be. So kudos to you for taking the time to want to learn more, both personally and professionally, and know that you're doing a fantastic job in what you're doing. And I know it can certainly be challenging, but we're always going to be here. And we certainly want to make sure that we're providing as many resources as we can. I will definitely follow up with a summary. And with that summary, Victoria's been kind enough to also, she'll share with me a copy of the slides. I'll make sure I get all of those to you as well. And again, as you guys have other questions, different things come up, certainly feel free to reach out. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and you guys have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.